that transparency is important. And the other thing that I noticed about going back and documenting things, I was able to go back and start seeing things that perhaps other people saw in me in those communication moments where there may have been stress points or miscommunication. I found myself being able to better analyze how to approach the situation moving forward in communication. And so it's really been helpful in that regard too. So I guess moving forward with documentation, what are some of the best things that you have learned through documenting? What are some of the best strategies that you have for documenting?
So I think documentation is great because it allows you to kind of operate at scale. Like if you have, for every onboarding, you have to kind of recount the history of the company and how you work together, communication practices. It doesn't work, and it will just dilute over time. Well, if you document it, you can keep kind of improving that documentation and actually make it stronger over time. Now, just by documenting, it doesn't mean it gets practiced. Like there needs to be training and enforcement and everything else. But it really helps to scale yourself and scale the organization you're with. I think the most important thing that we found is a practice at GitLab we call handbook first. If something should end up in the handbook eventually, then the only way you can communicate it is by changing the handbook and communicating that change. If you're first going to communicate it by email, Slack, a presentation, we're pretty sure it's not going to end up in the handbook because now it's double work and that doesn't work. Also, by putting it in the handbook first, you're going to be forced to deal with where should this live and how does it relate to other things? And we want you to deal with that while you're thinking of the idea. It's going to make the idea and the change better. And it's going to be much easier for people to understand the context of your idea because they can see where it lives and they can see what changes.
That makes a lot of sense too, because in trying to stick it in there, you actually get to live through how it disseminates instead of just like, we came up with this half-ass idea, we threw it on the wall, some of it stuck, and now we're left with a bastardized version of something that could have actually been really brilliant.
Yeah, and the organization will forget over 2 years, and someone in 2 years will have an alternative version, kind of similar idea, but different, and send a PowerPoint with a reminder for everyone. So it's very wasteful.
Well, and then also by documenting, it's easy to live through those processes too. If someone comes up with the idea again, we can say why it didn't stick or what, where it lives in that history, I guess.
And at GitLab, we're a bit nerdy because like the proposal to change the handbook, something you can comment on line by line and give suggestions for improvements and things like that. So it's also kind of a review of your idea at the same time.
Okay, so you have like a digital live handbook that you ultimately, that's
over
cool.
2,000 pages.
I was just going to ask how big it is. So then it must also probably be somewhat have a wiki or easily referenceable.
It's like a wiki, except in a wiki, it's easy to make a change. It's much harder to propose a change. Okay. And that change proposal process is super important, especially the fact that the person who makes the proposal and the person who approves it can be different people. And splitting those roles makes it much more scalable because only kind of the senior people will have the overview is like, is this a good idea? And the context of everything else. Well, the more junior people will have the time to make the proposal. So the ability to have those roles be split is super important.
That makes a lot of sense. I noticed as we try to practice sociocracy, we found similar things, at least even when running meetings about the people who the facilitator versus the person who makes the agenda, and how we go about kind of approving and on that sort of thing. I see the value in separating the roles because it really it allows people to use their brilliance, and shine in the ways that they're capable. So I really appreciate that. I think the other thing I've been learning in documentation too is the value is like, I can see how a company can get away from anyone really quickly, or how people are like, that's not how it happened. And if you have the documentation, you can be like, actually, here it is. I noticed that with a business partner, I don't know, working on John. You met John. I love John, but he was like, I had such a great idea about Art Nouveau. And I was like, I'm really glad you see that vision, because that is a vision that has been here for years. You know, I'm glad that you share in this.
I can identify with John. I frequently attribute great ideas that happen in a company to myself instead of realizing it was somebody else. And it's kind of, it's like my memory playing tricks on me, and it's really annoying. And I'm not proud of it, but it happens, and documentation helps. And just saying that it happens, so people feel free to correct me, and realizing that the best things that ever happened at GitLab were despite me, not because of me.
And I'm understanding that. I think that's the next thing I'm really trying to understand and struggle with, and maybe you can speak on this, is I understand a lot of leadership requires a fair amount of ego. And I don't mean this in a way of like, you know, it's me, I am great, but in the way that it requires ownership of something and sight of something. And it's not something that I hold naturally. I'm someone who, given my gifts, feel like I am just part of the fabric of everything that is. But in understanding that in order to be a better leader, that I need to take that ownership. So what are some of the things that you have implemented in your life that helps balance that, where it keeps you like strong enough to know that you're in charge, but also humble enough to know that like you're just part of it?
Yeah, I think what an organization typically needs is decisiveness. Most companies lack that.
Okay.
And I think especially systems like sociocracy and holacracy
Yeah.
lack speed of decision making. Okay. So at GitLab, if you Google GitLab making decisions, we try to combine the best of those type of consensus-based systems. And a really good thing about those is that you get more information. So when we make a decision, we encourage to make it very visible and to have the world chime in. Many things at GitLab are open to the entire world, so anybody can comment. That allows you to get much more kind of data. Is like, is this a good or bad idea? Is there stuff I don't know? Yeah. But it's the mistake I think a lot of companies make is then have the person who advocates for the change go back to all those people and try to convince them of the idea. That is super time consuming. So what people will do is try to have decisions fly under the radar so they get less input. But if they get less input, they learn less, and we might have taken a different decision if they were aware of all the facts and circumstances. So we say, okay, you got to open it up. Anyone can comment. And then you don't have to even acknowledge it, let alone convince people. You don't have to convince people. You don't even have to acknowledge their comments. We do expect you to read them. But you don't even have to like put an ice emoji on there to let them know you read it.
You don't need to validate them.
Nope. Because otherwise you slow down the speed of decision making.
Okay.
And I think your decisiveness as a CEO should vary on the subject, right? Is it urgent? Is it important? And many other questions. But on average, a lot of founder CEOs are pretty decisive people. And then they have a lot of self-doubt as well. But they don't let that influence their speed of decision making. And if you're not questioning yourself, you're a psychopath. So all the good people I know do that. Maybe there's some really great CEOs who don't. Like there's some famous CEOs who seem like they don't question themselves. Who knows? But most of the people I know do. And then you should take comfort in the fact that you're accountable too. in my case, accountable to shareholders, through a board, and kind of whether I'm doing a good job is kind of the board's problem. I'm just trying to do the best I can, and then they decide whether it's good enough for the company.
Yeah. So, getting to where you are now, what are some things that you wish you had done earlier in your career that you feel it was like the lesson you learned, and you're like, man, I wish I'd learned this 5-10 years ago?
I think learn how to program. I was hesitant. It looks very tedious to me. And then I saw Ruby and it looked beautiful as a language, and learn how to program. I was like, I should have done this earlier. This is super fun.
Okay. So the skills that you think are hard, you shouldn't wait to take them on, essentially.
Yeah, there's a famous story about Stripe, the payments company, that everyone kind of knew that it really was a miserable experience to sign up for credit cards.
Yeah.
And all the founders knew. They also started an e-commerce business. They knew this was bad, but everyone's like, oh, in order to improve that, you'll have to deal with the financial industry and everything else, and it's going to be super tedious. It's going to be a slap. And nobody did it, except for a few people, the item people in the Netherlands and the Stripe people and the checkout.com people. It turned out to be an amazing business because of that moat. Because it was so hard, it turned out to be a great business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, the harder it is, the less people there are to really like take that on. So when you're looking for holes or ways to improve the world, usually like no one's taking on the real hard projects.
And there's also a kind of it's Silicon Valley, I think, lore or accepted wisdom that if you do a really ambitious project, you're going to attract really good people, because most kind of startups are not very ambitious and pretty boring. So the only point I put on our agenda for this week, can we have a Pavilion of Men webpage with some history and the ambition?
Yeah.
It's a crazy big ambition to do like $1 billion plus art project that already failed a few times, and that like brought down the biggest creative artists of our time. Well, not of our time, kind of past time. But anyway, it's a compelling story. And sometimes it's easier to do something very, very hard because you can get people and investors more excited about it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that goes more into the lessons that I've been learning since our last meeting about documentation. And I've really been taking that into heart of like, when we're telling the story of the Pavilion of Man and ultimately trying to make a great piece about consciousness and what it is, it's such an expansive topic that encompasses the arts and the sciences and really every person on this planet. And it's so much there that the only way to really start like passing it forward is to start documenting it and to slowly tell the story, show them the picture.
I'm hearing this call with you because the Pavilion of Men, and because you called it a cursed project that you're taking on. Like, that is a pitch. Like that got my interest.
Yeah, I guess if you don't strive for the hardest thing you can think of, like, what are you even doing with your life?
Yeah, well, it's gonna attract some amazing people who want to like be a part of this, both as donors and investors and team members, I'm sure.
Well, and I really appreciate you also having sight and excitement about it. Like I said, just like your support alone is like, I know I can do it, but like I said, having the external responses to help quell some of the doubt is really what needs to happen in order to build something on this scale, in the next decade. And I'm really looking at each of the next 2 projects as the big lessons in getting to where this third project needs to be. And so it's starting off now with like just even a book and blue skying it and starting to like trickle down all the steps and aspects of it that I'd love to see in it, or could even dream of stuff that we might be at in 10 years that we don't even have now, and like what steps we could take to get things there to make these things possible. And with a project like that, it's easy to think that there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of steps.
Yeah, and I think we can take like at GitLab, one of our values is iteration. Take the smallest possible step and do it really quickly.
Yeah.
So for example, I think a book is a great idea. Now I'm going to give some ideas that are not good ideas, but just the way of thinking. Like so you can have the design competition for your design will never be built. Like the eventual design for the Pavilion of Man is still a couple of years out, and we're going to hire like the best in the world to work on that. So this design competition, we can promise you one thing: we're not going to build your design, but we're so excited about it. We just want to see some designs. So that's why we're having this design competition. Like instead of the fake promises of a design competition, make it kind of a brutal promise of your stuff will never get built, or have miniature versions. And miniature versions can be scaled down, but it can also take like one component of the Pavilion of Man and just build that in real size to show how big the eventual thing is. And then put those in different cities to get people excited about it. Look at the picture of the whole thing. And then, you know, that small thing on the picture, that's this giant thing right next to you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. Not everybody has the site inside their mind. And so being able to physically produce something that helps people see the vision is really powerful. It kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you've seen these at the Parthenon or different old archaeological sites, but they have these kind of pictures where they lay over transparent glass, like what it kind of looked like in the past using, you know, the pillars. So you kind of have a better scale of what's possible. And so I think, you know, even putting that into AR or different things that we could eventually do, I think would be really cool in getting people to realize.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to try and do that too further, not just with Headmaze, but also Sulfite or the Embrace. You know, I say it's in front of Sulfite Stadium now, but you know, we're still in negotiations there. We still have to figure out, you know, where it's going in the end. But it is all these little steps and the documentations and the blue sky planning. You know, I really love that design competition idea. I've definitely been through won a few of those in my life, and I'm always a little sad when they never get built, but I understand that that's how they work, you know, that you're there to bring the ideas and inspire others and kind of like start really, it's kind of like how you put it into the handbook by physically building something or documenting it or putting it into paper. It becomes a lot easier to figure out how it's going to work in real time in life. So I'm trying to think.
Thanks for the conversation.
Of course. Thank you so much always for sitting and talking. I hope you have a lovely time in LA, and I'm